Hello everybody, and welcome to the 10th episode of the Overly Sarcastic podcast. I'm your host, Blue. That's kind of the same as usual. I don't know why I mentioned that. You probably figured out it was me by my voice and my character face and the fact that there's a kind of blue avatar of me, whose name is Blue, in the thumbnail. I'm getting off topic. The point is, I'm here today to do a podcast for you, my wonderful viewers, on the sort of pre-Socratic through Aristotelian conception of psuche over time in ancient Greece. Why am I doing such a weirdly broad and also specific topic at the same time? Well, dear viewer, that's because I have a final tomorrow on exactly this, so I am internally justifying this to myself as studying, so I can sleep at night. The first among these pre-Socratic-y types is a guy named Thales. Thales is very famous for saying that the origin of everything that exists and the kind of underlying substance that makes our world live is water. And he justified this by saying, well, if you look at animals and plants and everything that lives, it's all water. All of our, earth around us is water. Water, water, water. Everything that we have in our world comes from this one fundamental substance. And the Greek word for this is arche. It's like a cause and a beginning, but also the underlying principle that is the reason why things stay the way they are. The reason things exist is because of water, and the reason things continue to exist is also because of water. And one of the problems with the pre-Socratics is that they don't really say a lot because we don't really have anything that they wrote. But if you take what Thales says and extrapolate it a little bit, you can consider in Thales' eyes that the soul is essentially water, because the soul is what gives life. So to him, water is the soul. So that's all well and good, and then a couple hundred odd years later, this other guy, Democritus, comes by and says, up. No, not so fast there, buddy. I think that the arche of everything that exists is these tiny little things that you cannot cut in half, and for that I will call them uncut inhalfable things, which in Greek is atomos. And that may sound familiar because you are probably familiar with the English word atoms, and that's where this idea comes from. Now, this may seem very, very radically futurist and modern, because it is, and he kind of got buried by a bunch of other people later on, cough, cough, Aristotle, but to him, there is no conception of a soul the way that we would think of it. He thinks that everything is fundamentally material. There's nothing that's like ephemeral and not really existing. Everything that exists is made of atoms. So what we would call the soul, or the psuche if we're using the Greek, he would also say is made of atoms. So to him, there really is no soul, there's only the mind. So Democritus was the first, quantum mechanicist, I don't know if that's the right word, but he was also, a pioneer in what we would now today call neuroscience. So he's way, way forward thinking, which is really neat. Next up in our line of pre-Socratic thinkers is Pythagoras, whose theorem you're probably familiar with. He's the guy who did all that triangle stuff. He, as you might guess, thought that the arche of everything that existed was numbers. Because, you could look at everything in the world and see numbers. One of those famous examples was if you think about music. That's something that's very, very fluid and natural and dynamic and all these cool, intangible things, but it's ratios, it's harmonics, it's things that you can calculate mathematically. So he said, if music is numbers, everything has to be numbers at a fundamental level. And, he's right. If you look at the laws of physics, it's all numbers there. So we're good. This is great. We're off to a great start. He's totally on the ball, and then he promptly falls right off of it when he makes his next giant statement, that reincarnation is a thing because all souls are immortal, which kind of seems to come out of nowhere, but if you take a look at it and think through it, you can understand why he comes to this conclusion. This comes back in Plato a little bit later, and it's called the Affinity Argument, being that if you can see a chair or touch a table, a physical thing, in this case your eyes and your hand, are interacting with physical things, i.e. a chair and a table. So there's an affinity between the two. Physical things can comprehend, or in this case perceive, physical things. But if instead my mind is to think about something mathematical like 2 + 2 = 4, I can't perceive that through physical means. I can't touch 2 + 2 = 4. It's just an intangible fact of nature. To do that, I can't use physical means to perceive it. I have to rely on my mind, my psuche, essentially, to understand these concepts. And then if my hand and my eyes are physical things interacting with physical things and perceiving them, my psuche, in perceiving mathematical truths, must be in some way like those things. So it too must be intangible, invisible, immaterial, but also permanent. Because numbers don't die. They can be replaced and kind of rearranged into 1.5 million different permutations, but the numbers are always numbers. They don't go away. So he interpreted this in humans as A, the soul is immortal, but also B, that reincarnation has to happen and souls can jump around between different bodies. Now this is a bit of a jump, but here's an example that might make it a little bit clearer. Put a pencil on your desk and put another pencil on your desk. Now take one pencil away and replace it with, one of those little pink pearl erasers. You still have two things on your desk, so the soul, so to speak, big air quotes, the number 2, is still present. But the physical object, in this case the pencil being swapped out for eraser, is what changes. So if you think about it through Pythagoras' eyes, he sees it as the soul being constant and human, even though the body changes. So his famous example was, oh yeah, I saw some dog getting kicked on the side of the street, and I thought, oh my god, that's my friend Callius from 2nd grade. And this is obviously ridiculous to us, but to him, it makes sense. So mini recap, so far we've seen Thales, Democritus, and Pythagoras, all of whom offer a different idea for what the arche of everything is. And then we get into the 5th-ish century and ancient Athens, where everyone's coming together because it's where all the smart people are, and everything gets a little bit weird because there's a sudden flourishing of the sophist community. And the two big people there are Protagoras, not Pythagoras, Protagoras, and Gorgias. And Gorgias, besides having a funny name, was known as the guy who could argue anything. So if you wanted to know how to argue your way out of debts, he was the guy to go to. It's said that he had the back pocket argument he would like to pull out and show off at parties, that he can prove nothing exists, therefore I don't owe you any money, because money doesn't exist, debt doesn't exist, and you and I don't even exist. And it worked, apparently. So he and a couple other people, some other sophists, had schools where they would teach people how to be sophists and how to argue their way out of anything. As you might imagine, these guys were hardcore relativists, and at least Gorgias thought that you can really convince anyone of everything, because nothing is true. There's no one fundamental truth to look after, like the philosophers thought that we just talked about. To Gorgias, the only thing that exists that we can really grasp onto is doxa, a word for belief or opinion of things. His big thing was a defense speech he made to try to acquit Helen of all charges, of all guilt that people had associated with her. Because, let me tell you, ancient Athenians hated Helen, a lot. So to try and prove Helen innocent was a serious undertaking. And there are two things that are going on here. One, he believes that he can convince you of anything, namely that Helen is innocent, which is a really tough undertaking. But also, in the middle of this, this defense speech, he's listing off the different ways in which Helen could have been taken. She was captured, she was, stolen by the gods, in which case it's a necessity and you can't argue with that, or she was convinced by Paris. And this one's the tricky one. He goes in a little bit of a tangent to explain that the effect of logos, of speech, on the soul, psuche, is like drugs on the body. And it's a really interesting play what Gorgias is doing right now. It's an interesting dance that he has going on. He's, at the same time, convincing you of something and explaining how it is that he's convincing you of something. If you're a master of rhetoric, rhetorique, persuasion, you can control someone's very being simply through speech. And he really knew that, which is why he charged so much for his services to teach people these things. Next up, after Gorgias, we have the other main sophist, who is Protagoras. And you may be familiar with his most famous saying, that is, human being is the measure of all things. And this sentence in itself is a little bit tricky to unpack, and you can have a bunch of different interpretations of it, which is kind of the point. You can think of it as either human being measures all things, and therefore everything that exists is subject to the individual perception of human beings, or perhaps more likely, everything that exists is subject to the perception of human beings as a species. Another way to think about it that's somewhat similar is that everything in the world is measured against the standard of mankind. So therefore, man is the measure means human beings are like a ruler that everything gets measured against. So it's very tricky to unpack, and everyone can really come away with this with a different interpretation, but they all get to the same truth, essentially, that life is super relativistic, and whether it's moral relativism, I think in this case is what he might be getting at, or that the things that we perceive in our world are specific to how we take them in, and that a tree falling in the forest, if no one can hear it, is really nothing without the human being to measure it against. Or you can go the route of Gorgias, and that nothing is true except for the things that it can persuade you to believe. And Protagoras doesn't really have a strict opinion of the soul. He says that it's impossible to know anything of the gods because human beings just don't have the faculties to understand them. So I'd imagine that much in that vein he'd say, well, I don't really know anything about the soul. The only thing that I, as a human being, can be aware of are the things that human beings, very, material in this world's entities, can comprehend. And as far as he can tell, the soul isn't one of those things, so he just figures, ignore it. Focus on living in the moment and not caring about what happens after death. And this is actually very much in line with what happens in the Odyssey, because Odysseus goes down into the underworld, and it's generally interpreted as Homer thinking, yes, there is an underworld, people live on after death, but if you look at the descriptions of the shades and how they're talked about, how Odysseus interacts with them, they really only exist in the mind of the living. They only do anything when Odysseus is there to interact with them. Protagoras is pretty much in the same boat. What happens after death is irrelevant, just focus on living life. And everyone can have a different way of doing that because, hey, moral relativism, woo! So that's those guys, and in the same time period as the sophists, we have Socrates, who we get through Plato, and a lot of times it's very difficult to distinguish what philosophy is probably Socratic and what philosophy is probably Platonic, because Socrates is a historical figure, we know he was real, but we don't have anything that he wrote, because he thought writing was terrible, and it makes you dumb because you rely on things that are written down that are easily recallable instead of actually having a memory and conversing with things, because he said you can't interrogate a text as you can interrogate a person, which is kind of important because he's the guy who did the whole dialogues thing. His whole idea of how philosophy works is that it only exists in conversation, it never happens in a vacuum. But thankfully someone did just decide to write stuff down all day long, and his name is Plato, so we have to be very thankful for Plato. Thank you, Plato. He wrote all the dialogues that we have of Socrates. And it's tricky to sort them out because the earlier dialogues that we have, the more historical ones like the Apology, the Crito, the Euthyphro, are probably more accurate to what Socrates, the historical figure, thought. The later ones, most specifically the Republic, are definitely more Platonic in nature, and it's probably Plato's own philosophy described through the mouthpiece of Socrates for the sake of maintaining some narrative consistency. The Socratic dialogues in question that relate to the soul are the Meno and the Phaedo. The Meno is just a run-of-the-mill dialogue, and the Phaedo is a dramatic retelling of Socrates' death scene. So in the Meno, Socrates is talking to this guy whose name is Meno, and he's kind of an ass. He doesn't really want to learn anything, he just wants to have answers that he can pull out and, show off at parties and think, yes, I'm smart because Socrates agrees with me. So the dialogue opens with Meno saying, Socrates, tell me, do you think that virtue can be taught? And Socrates asks, well, what do you think virtue is? And then I'll try to give you a better answer. And Meno kind of flounders around and doesn't really know what's going on, because Socrates is very much a fan of making people figure things out for themselves instead of just taking answers that he preaches as gospel. But Meno isn't really about that. He doesn't want to learn, he just wants to be right and wants to have answers, as opposed to Socrates, who's all about asking questions. So, Socrates asks his main question to Meno, T-S-T, what is it? In this case, what is virtue? If you want me to tell you if I think it can be taught, we need to figure out what virtue is first. And this goes on a couple paths of logic that I'm not really going to get into. Read the Spark Notes or something. The dialogues are short. Go read it your damn self. And eventually, Meno gets really, really, really fed up with Socrates and says, all right, Socrates, I've had it with you. I think that learning is impossible for two reasons. Because one, if you already know what something is, you can't learn it because you've already learned it. But if you don't know what something is yet, you can't learn it because you don't know what you're supposed to be learning because you don't know it yet. Therefore, learning is impossible. Ha! And this sets Socrates off a weird and kind of interesting path of reasoning, which he goes into for the rest of the dialogue. And this is the so-called slave boy geometry argument, which is kind of weird, but just bear with me. So he goes to Meno's slave boy and says, here, slave boy, come here, let's do some math. Not meth, math. I should put that on a bumper sticker. Math, not meth. And he leads him through this lesson of geometry and basically gets him to figure out what the square root of the side of something is. It doesn't really matter. And he figures out that, this is whatever the geometrical problem is. And Socrates says, well, this kid clearly never learned it, but he gave you an answer, so what's up there? And then he goes off a little bit into left field and says, you see, Meno, souls are immortal. And this boy didn't just learn this right now because I didn't teach it to him, he obviously must have known it before. I think that the soul is immortal, and all the knowledge that we have, we are simply recollecting from a past life and we just forgot it at birth. So every time we think we're learning something, we're really only remembering that we knew it all along. And this is weird, and I don't really like it that much. But if you think about it in a more abstract sense, instead of going up to a store and asking, how much does the milk cost? And he says 50 cents. And you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I knew that. No, it's not like that. It's not like you actually remember everything that is. The main issue is a priori knowledge. Knowledge that comes, it's innate. It comes before anything else. It's before experience. And if you think about it, Socrates is right, because we have DNA. We have instructions on how to grow and how to, eat and do all these things. And we know it. We're never taught it, but you know how to breathe from the moment you're born. Your heart knows how to beat. All humans possess the ability to reason innately. It's just, that's how it works. So while modern philosophy has somewhat vindicated Socrates in his time, there's really no way to justify this, so the argument is intentionally flimsy because you, the reader, are supposed to see this and think about it and completely dismantle it in your mind, because it's rife with problems. And there's a reason for this. Plato, in writing this very flimsy argument, is proving Meno's paradox wrong, because you can think. You, the reader, can process information and figure things out with it and decide this is good, this is logical, it makes sense, and this completely doesn't. So even though Socrates' argument did not prove Meno's paradox wrong, Plato does. As far as it's in the text, Socrates says the soul is immortal, and everything that we know, we simply recollect from a previous life. Where that information came from, never explained. How we forget it, never explained. Why the soul's immortal, not really explained in this dialogue at least. But you have a very nuanced perspective on where the soul comes from and where information comes from. So this is expanded upon in the next dialogue, the Phaedo, which I'm not going to really get into, but I will say that Socrates explains essentially what I described earlier, the Affinity Argument, that the body is very similar to the things in the physical world that we can perceive through our senses, and the soul, or the psuche, is very much alike these mental things that we can perceive that we can't physically interact with. So therefore, the soul must be like these immaterial, intangible things. And the rest of the dialogue, Socrates goes on and talks about death and stuff like that. That's not really important to our purposes, but what matters is that we don't really need to consider Plato, who wrote these Socratic Dialogues, as holding these opinions honestly. The reason he frames everything the way he does is to basically get to the point that philosophy is essentially the celebration of your soul. When you practice philosophy, you're doing things that are much more related to these, immaterial, eternal matters than eating a sandwich with your friends, which has its own value, as Aristotle will go into ad nauseum in the Nicomachean Ethics. But practicing philosophy is celebrating the fact that you have a soul. Last on our list here, and I will be short because this is going way over how long I thought it would take, but granted I am trying to summarize an entire 4-month course in the span of 20 minutes, Aristotle talks about how substance is made of two things, form and shape. This is in Greek holomorphic. Hule is matter, morphe is shape. So everything that exists has two components. And you can consider them through the lens of actuality versus potentiality. So say there's a giant pile of wood, in a craftsman's shop. That wood can be anything, but it isn't anything yet. When the craftsman decides to put it into the shape of a table, then it's actualized, it's something, and that is a substance, whereas just kind of a lump of wood on its own isn't a substance, it's just matter because it doesn't have form yet. In the case of humans, Aristotle explains that it's ridiculous to try and ask whether or not the body and soul can be separate, as you see in cases of Plato and a couple other philosophers. Aristotle says that the body and the soul are only linked. They can't be separated. Neither one really exists without the others. If you have, the shape of a chair without the wood to make the chair out of, you don't have anything. And if you have wood without a shape, it isn't anything either. In the case of humans, again, getting back to this, Aristotle is adamant about the fact that the body and the soul cannot be separated because they aren't two separate things. A living human is the union of body, which is the matter, and the soul, the psuche, which in this case is the form. The soul is the actuality of a body, because without a soul, without psuche, which is a much better word for Aristotle here than just soul, you have a body, soulless, which is just a corpse. It's dead. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have a form. It doesn't have the animating principle that makes it alive. The most basic function of a thing that lives is to perform nutrition on itself. You take in food from external sources and break it down into its most fundamental components and make the food like you, so it matches your matter. I eat an apple, I don't become an apple, but all of the fundamental materials in that apple, the minerals, vitamins, whatever, fats, carbs, I have no idea what's actually in apples, but all of those, nutritive elements inside of it get broken down and transformed into my own body because my psuche, my soul, does the act of nutrition to keep me alive. Because when my soul stops doing that, I stop being separate from my environment and I just become a pile of organic matter, in the ground in a box. It's not life without the psuche being there to animate something into existence. He often gets some flack for saying that, quote, plants have souls, but this statement is really a misunderstanding of what Aristotle's on about. He's not saying that plants have souls in the way that, humans have perception and can think about things and, interact on an intellectual level. He's saying that plants also have the capacity to do nutrition on themselves. They have that psuche, that form to them. Same for animals that can perform nutrition and also they can perceive, unlike plants. And same for humans, which can perform nutrition, can perceive, and can also intellect things. And that's, to Aristotle's mind, what separates humans from all other animals, that we can do intellection. We're smart, we can think about things beyond just perceiving them and having a very baseline understanding of how things work based on our physical senses. We have that more abstract connection along the lines of Plato or Pythagoras, and that is the component of the soul that's very unique to humans as opposed to everything else. But again, on the base level, Aristotle thinks that everything that can keep itself separate from its environment and contain its form independently is alive. A table doesn't stay a table, it degrades, it changes over time, it loses its form as it erodes, but a human, so long as it has its psuche, keeps itself together and keeps its matter in one place. So, that was very long, painfully so. If you made it through, you're a champ and you know a lot more about pre-Socratic, Socratic, and post-Socratic philosophy than you knew. I'm personally just glad I got to do something halfway productive with my day of studying. So if this did benefit you, that's great, but honestly, I just was going to have to go through all this anyway and figured I might as well make a podcast out of it. So thank you for listening to this 10th episode of the Overly Sarcastic Podcast, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.